Next up, we have Andrew Little, who's also a political scientist in the department at UC Berkeley, and he's going to tell us about a behavioral theory of discrimination in policing.
Great. So thanks so much to the organizers for putting together this great program and including us. In a way, like this feels a little bittersweet, and this conference is like so unusually packed with like people that I was like really excited to meet. And unfortunately, we couldn't do that in person, but hopefully we'll get to do that soon. This is joint work with Ryan Hubert, who's in the audience here. So feel free to interrupt me if you want, but if you want to do a lighter touch option, you can type questions into the chat and he'll be happy to respond. So if you're here for Aislin's introduction, I think really like to summarize it, she was saying from the economic perspective, we sort of know that disparities exist in a lot of contexts. It's important to understand where they come from, and that one thing that hasn't been explored enough is incorrect beliefs. And so I swear to you, with like no editing, here's the opening from the previous time I gave this talk. Policing disparities are well documented, as you all know. Sources of disparities matter, and here's a few reasons why. It matters in terms of legally, it matters in terms of policy, and underexplored mechanism is incorrect beliefs. So if you were hoping to get like a different perspective from the political scientists, then hopefully you got it from Andrew in the previous talk. So it's probably not a coincidence that we're thinking about this in the same way, because sort of as Ryan and I were kind of working through the ideas of this paper, it was super helpful when we came along the work of Aislinn and Alex and others of thinking about both discrimination and other questions in the context of what they call a misspecified model of the world. And so we think that this is a really exciting area of theory these days. In part because I think it creates sort of a nice connection between what most of the more empirically minded scholars are working on and kind of what theorists are doing. So most of what empirical scholars are doing these days is trying to take data and learn about causal effects or some other parameters from that data. Right? We want to know causal effect of getting a degree on your income, or if we police a group more, what's going to happen, something like that. And so when we're writing theoretical models, we typically either will just take it as a given that the actors know these parameters if we want to make our lives easier, or if we want to be a little more realistic, we might assume that they learn about these parameters from their experience. And obviously this is going on in Andrew's paper too, previous Andrew's paper. We actually taught a class together once. It was very confusing for the students. Too many Andrews. So the question we're going to kind of ask here, or why we think this is a nice connection between theory and empirical work, is so once you sort of open the black box of like, or the Pandora's box of what if people form beliefs incorrectly, there's sort of an infinite number of ways to do it. But we think that these misspecified models give a nice way to ask, okay, well, what if the actors in our models make the exact kind of mistakes that we know are easy to make based on what we do when we're trying to learn about causal effects from data? Right? So we know from our own work and from teaching, like learning about causal effects, learning about parameters is hard. What if say police officers make the same kind of mistakes that we know that our students and even well-trained researchers make? And so in particular, the bias we're going to study is one that I think is I would argue probably one of the more ubiquitous statistical mistakes that people make, which is not thinking about the selection process that produces the data they observe. Okay. So there's a couple of nice recent papers that refer to this as selection neglect. It's also closely related to an older idea, kind of from the Kahneman and Tversky tradition. They call this the what you see is all there is. That maybe just the data in front of me is like what I should learn from, without necessarily thinking about the process that produced it. And so effectively, we're going to ask how discrimination in policing might be driven by this kind of inferential mistake. We think it's a particularly good area to apply this kind of approach, not only because until these recent papers, the notion that discrimination might be driven by incorrect beliefs was just barely even considered. So we're kind of continuing in that new tradition. And there's also really just direct evidence that both citizens and police officers and researchers kind of have incorrect beliefs about the prevalence of crime. So it seems like a kind of a natural domain to see how these ideas play out. This obviously will be familiar to most people, but to kind of couch it in the language we like, you can kind of think of the standard economic or political economy explanations of discrimination as either being driven by preferences, so taste-based discrimination, officers just having animus towards a group that might affect who they stop and where they allocate their time. Or it could be driven by beliefs, right? They have beliefs about the previous discussion was exactly about this, beliefs about which groups are likely to carry contraband, which neighborhoods have higher prevalence of crimes and therefore should be the target of our resources. So if I could just make sort of like one meta point for kind of the empirical people studying this, particularly if you like think in terms of causal diagrams or DAGs or what have you, then I think kind of the standard view here would sort of like not have our little orange arrow here and thinks of these as just independent forces affecting police behavior or discrimination, right? That there's just these like two separate channels and like the job of the empiricist is to like tell them apart. Seems to be you tell me if that's like a rude caricature, but it seems like a reasonable description of like what's going on in a lot of the empirical domain. So what we want to put out here is that like really the causal model you should have in your head, once you accept the fact that officers don't process information correctly, actually has another causal arrow that goes from their behavior back to their beliefs. And so as long as they don't sort of perfectly understand the data generating process, there's going to be a feedback loop where the sort of decisions they make at one point in time are going to later affect their beliefs, which then affect their behavior. And sort of once you accept that this is a relevant causal model, you can see that not only are things more complicated, but that sort of preference-based discrimination is actually going to cause changes in beliefs and cause inaccurate beliefs. And so, you know, we don't sort of have like an answer of like what you do about this yet, but if nothing else, we sort of want to make sure that this is sort of on people's minds. More concretely, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a very basic model of policing. It might actually sort of offend you in how basic it is if you're really well versed in a lot of the nuances here. Where we're going to have an officer or officers who want to allocate more time and resources towards policing groups, broadly speaking, that have higher crime rates. Their decision also might be affected by other things. In particular, the one we're going to focus on is the potential for racial animus against certain groups. So in most models, they would kind of know these crime rates, and we might think about, again, how animus or beliefs drive their decisions. But the crucial thing we're going to add is that they're going to learn about the crime rates from the kind of data which is produced by their past decisions. And not only that, but we're gonna outside of a benchmark case, we're going to assume that they sort of don't do that entirely correctly. So they're going to have data available to them, which I think bears some resemblance to what we think they have in reality. And they're going to kind of like almost do the right thing, but make a mistake in how they process that. And in particular, the mistake they're going to make is this notion of selection neglect, that they're going to not sufficiently condition on the fact that if you police one group more, they're going to show up more in the crime data. That's going to be sort of the crux of the mistake that they're going to make. So what we're going to find in the model is first, with just a single officer, we're going to find that this creates a positive feedback loop, where the more you police a group, the more that leads you to have incorrect beliefs that make you want to continue over policing them. But still, nicely from an analytic perspective, we're not going to get just a total runaway situation where you just have one equilibrium where you always police group A, one equilibrium where you always police group B. We're actually going to mostly sort of find interior solutions where we can take comparative statics on how various exogenous parameters affect things. So we're not going to enter like a totally nihilistic world where anything can happen because of incorrect beliefs. The main feature that is going to come out of this model is that this non-conditioning bias, so not processing the data correctly, is always just going to amplify whatever discrimination would always exist. So think about whatever discrimination you would get with full information. We're just going to take that, and it can expand really to an arbitrary degree when officers make this inferential mistake. And again, another way to think about that is it's actually taste-based discrimination is causing statistical discrimination, or inaccurate statistical discrimination in particular. We then have an extension where we have multiple officers where we're going to effectively study the contagion of discrimination across officers. So once you kind of understand the logic of the main model, this is technically a little messy, but conceptually pretty straightforward, that if sort of some officers are racist and are policing one group a lot, that's going to sort of distort the crime data, and even officers with no animus can end up discriminating as well.
Is there a principal distinction between animus generating certain priors versus animus actually distorting the updating mechanism?
Yes, so we're going to think about like there's going to be an exogenous parameter that's sort of how wrong your belief formation is, and an exogenous parameter that's your animus, and those things are going to be distinct. So it's, I mean, they're going to combine to create the incorrect beliefs, but we're like not assuming that more racist people, or the people with more animus in terms of their preferences, process information in a worse way. Though, like when you combine the forces, that ends up happening endogenously.
Right.
We're thinking of these as like separate features of people. Does that answer your question?
Largely, it seemed to me that there is an interesting distinction between what I'll call bad priors versus the inability to process information.
Yes.
Versus bad priors leading, and this is what Conrad mentioned, bad priors lead to segregation, so no information is provided for updating. But you know, you're after different objectives.
Yes. So yeah, we're gonna purposely set things up so like the prior in a sense does not matter, and we're gonna kind of look at a steady state. Though, you know, if you sort of think about sort of small samples, then that would matter too. Yeah. Okay. So let's get to the model. So the environment we're going to study, pretty simple one. So we're going to have two groups A and B. We'll use J for a generic group. And to avoid having to think about like normalizations about group size, just assume that they're of equal size. The two groups are going to be characterized by what we're going to call crime rates, so PA and PB. We're going to think of these as exogenous, though I'll revisit that in a second. And think of this as just sort of for a typical member of the group, what's sort of the number of crimes committed per unit of time is the easiest way to interpret this parameter. There's going to be some time spent policing each group. So some high-level decision maker or later decision makers are going to decide this. And so we'll let WA be the share of time spent policing group A. And so 1 minus WA is the time with group B. And we're going to make another sort of very simple assumption that the amount of crime that you catch among a particular group is just going to be the product of the amount of time you spend policing them times this rate. Right? So yeah, think of these PAs as like crimes per unit of time. Think of the WA or WJ as how much time you spend. That's going to lead to the total crimes detected. We're going to assume that the decision makers are going to have some leeway in terms of how much time they spend policing each group. And so you can think of this as a few ways. It could be the explicit targeting of groups, though obviously that's illegal in the United States at least. But really, you could probably more realistically, this is could be driven by deciding to spend more time policing certain neighborhoods. And then due to residential segregation, that's going to have the effect of sort of putting officers in contact with more people in that group and presumably detecting more crime as well. So formally, someone who I'll call sort of like the chief or the officer for now is going to make some allocation decision between a lower bound W lower and an upper bound W upper, with the constraints that we're always going to assume that equal policing is possible. So we don't want to like assume discrimination by the bounds. We are going to assume that they can't entirely police one group or the other, though that's primarily for technical reasons, but it's probably realistic as well. You know, they can't say, you know, literally never arrest a person from group A. So the preferences. So this is like another nice segue from before. So I'm gonna do something. Maybe Stephen isn't gonna like this, but then I'll hopefully placate him in a second. We're going to assume that the officer here is going to derive utility from catching crime, and so. Times CA, so like crimes caught in group A times how much I like.
Andrew, you froze for a little bit.
Oh, sorry, I just got a
15 seconds.
Sorry about that. So yeah, so we're going to assume the officer utility. They want to catch crimes amongst both groups. So the utility is going to be increasing in this TA times CA, TB times CB. And so these T parameters are scaling how much you like catching crime among each group. And as we'll see, that's going to be our way to capture racial animus. We're also going to assume diminishing returns of the crime you catch within each group, which is sort of capturing the idea that maybe you sort of catch the more important crimes first, and then you're just kind of getting minor offenses within the group. We make some other technical assumptions too, but I'll probably gloss over those unless someone asks. If you like sort of particular functional forms, a nice one that meets these assumptions and leads to good closed form solutions is just think of the utility as the square root of this TA times the crime caught among group A plus square root of TB times crime caught among B. So just to say like a couple things that people often don't like about our setup and why we think it's probably okay. So first, importantly, you might think that the crime rates are going to respond to the policing allocations, right? So if you send more police to a certain neighborhood, that hopefully will deter some crime in that area. You can modify the model to capture that. So you can think of like there's a baseline crime rate, and then it's going to be decreasing as you spend more time policing that group. That's just going to effectively lead to there being more diminishing returns of policing each group. So things are a little more complicated because now we have to think of like the relationship between the baseline crime rates rather than actual crime rates, but it sort of doesn't fundamentally change the insights. You might also think that this is like really the point of policing is to minimize crime and to try and deter crime. So the fact that crime rates may be decreasing in resources might be the point. You might like want to just be reducing total crime. That leads to similar dynamics where you're going to want to allocate more time to the group with a higher baseline crime rate. So sort of different utility function, but will lead to the same premise or same results. Okay, so with full information, so if you know the true crime rates, this leads to a pretty straightforward maximization problem, where we can write the optimal allocation of how much time you spend policing group A. We'll write that as WA dagger, and we can write that as a function of not only like all these four taste and crime rate parameters, but really just as a function of two ratios. So first, this RT is capturing the ratio of these T parameters. And so that's kind of capturing, do you like catching crime among group A or group B more? The second one is this RP parameter. And so that's the ratio of the real crime rates between the two groups. Okay. So the optimal allocation is just a function of those two ratios. And naturally, as probably is intuitive, it's going to be increasing in both those two ratios. So if I have animus towards group A, I police them more. If group A has a higher real crime rate, I police them more as well. And so really, again, you can think about different utility functions. As long as the utility functions has this general property, then sort of everything we say is going to go through. And with our sort of nice square root functional form, this takes on a really nice form of it's just the product of the ratios divided by 1 plus the product of the ratios. Okay, so some useful benchmarks. So again, this WA dagger, that's going to be what an officer would do with full information. We had sort of no uncertainty about the crime rates. Sort of harkening back to some classic work, we might also think a useful benchmark is what an officer who had correct beliefs and no animus would do. So I'm putting up like plopping in a 1 here for the RT to indicate the officer has no animus, the ratio of 1 meaning the taste parameters are equal. And so if the real crime rates are different, that there might also be some difference, but that would just be purely because of statistical discrimination. And then a final benchmark might be just what you do if you have no animus and the real crime rates are equal, which is just to police both groups equally. One thing which we can kind of revisit if you'd like, so we're not taking a stance on like which of these is like the right level of policing. I think it depends a lot on your sort of societal objective function and various other assumptions about spillovers. But the broader point is we sort of think of these as useful benchmarks without taking a strong stance on like what we think we want officers to do. We probably can certainly say we don't want disparities to be driven by animus. The degree to which we're okay with disparities being driven by statistical reasons is sort of up for debate. Okay, so now let's get to the heart of what's different about our model, is that we're going to assume that our chief or our officer does not know this ratio of the crime rates. We'll assume they know their own taste parameters. It's actually kind of interesting to like Andrew's like conscious versus unconscious. They know that they like catching crime among one group more. And I'll write, if I put a tilde over the R, that's going to correspond to the belief which sort of arrives endogenously in the model. So RP with no tilde is going to be the truth. When we add a tilde, that's going to be the officer's belief. We're going to assume that the officer has data, which is probably realistic and what officers and researchers might have, which is that they're going to have the crime data. They're going to know how many crimes they detect among each group. And we're also going to assume that they know the allocations as well. they don't know the allocations, then the problem we're going to describe is even worse. But let's give them a chance that they actually have the data on how much time is spent policing each group as well. So if what they want to do is learn the true crime rates, they have a pretty easy algebra problem to do, right? So the crime you catch among group J is just PJ times WJ. So if you know CJ and WJ, you can just divide CA times WA, and there you go, you've learned the crime rate. Do that for both groups, and you can back out the real ratio of crime rates, right? So this is kind of the correct belief formation. A very incorrect thing that you might do, and actually what you might do if you don't have access to the data on allocations, is you could just look at the ratio of the crimes that you detect among the two groups, right? So think of this as, we're calling this non-conditioning bias, because you're not properly conditioning on the fact that when you police a group more, you're going to detect more crime. So this might be a natural thing to do. I'm just going to look at the crime data, see where we detect more crime. I'm going to think that whichever group shows up more, relative to their population, is one that I should police more. But so importantly, then if that's what you do, then all of a sudden your belief is going to become endogenous to the choices you make, right? As I police group A more, they show up more in the crime data, that affects my belief, which would not be true when the information is processed correctly. So I'm not going to put the algebra on the slide here. Obviously, it's in the paper. We're going to sort of allow for a range of possibilities between these two extremes. So this new parameter is going to capture the degree to which you don't properly condition on these allocations, right? So when nu is equal to 0, we're in perfect belief world. When nu is equal to 1, we make a very big inferential mistake. We also in the paper have a bit of a micro foundation of kind of saying that this could come out of having a sort of a wrong sense of the crime production function when you're forming beliefs. But I'll kind of skip over that here. The real important implication here is that as long as this new parameter is greater than 0, so as long as you don't perfectly process the data, the belief that you have about the relative crime rate of the two groups is going to become increasing in the amount of time you spend policing group A. So this is going to endogenously create a link between the actions taken and the beliefs moving forward. So if you sort of are not convinced that this is a reasonable thing to assume, sort of give you two angles to attack that. So one is that there's some really nice recent experimental papers that find evidence of biases like this. So these are lab experiments where people are kind of like playing games about guessing averages. But it seems pretty clear that people do not do a good job of adjusting for selection problems in the data in front of them. And again, really, if you doubt this bias is real, I don't think you've ever taught research design or econometrics. This is like one of the biggest things that students and faculty struggle with. In the context of policing, you often see this logic even among officers who are trying to explain why there's disparities in crime data. Right? So the chief of police in LA says, if officers are looking for criminal activity, they're going to look at the kind of people who are listed in crime reports. So literally admitting that they're making this inferential mistake that we're studying here. This also even shows up in the court case about stop and frisk, that the judge is actually noticing this potential problem. Okay, so any questions on that? Am I sounding okay now? Have I totally confused people?
Yeah, Andrew, I just wanted to point out that this is also a case study that most business schools use to teach their MBAs. So this really? This is called speed ventures. This neglect of information that's missing. So it's like a great exercise because every single student in an MBA course will fall for it. And this is actually what happened with the Challenger disaster. So the case study is based on the Challenger disaster, where and then essentially they repackage it, and I do it in every single class. Basically, I teach as I run this case, and it works every single time. So
great. So Alex believes this bias is real. So
I believe it.
Good to go. Yeah. No, and I think just the evidence is everywhere.
Andrew, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, of course.
I guess the problem here is going to get much more worse when we relax the assumption that policing is sort of random within groups. So it just sort of W just sort of scales up and down the observed crime rate. In reality, we might think that there's sort of differential signal quality or something by groups. So, there's sort of a differential selection problem. It's not just sort of picking more actual crimes as being observed, but maybe you target better the certain crimes for certain groups. That's probably going to create headaches for your model, but I wonder if you have anything to say about sort of that extension of sort of non-random selection bias as well.
So sorry, I'm trying to understand this. Yeah, so we're, as you sort of speculate, we're like going to be in kind of an asymptotic world where we like collect enough data and we're not going to kind of worry about small sample issues. And so you're thinking that there might be an additional bias.
No, it's not so much about estimation. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think in your model, there's like true crime. And then as you ramp up and down policing, you're just sort of observing randomly sort of a larger share of the actual crime in the population. But in reality, policing might be targeted. So you are able to pick up more crime sort of, you're more skilled at picking up crime, perhaps in some groups versus than others. So you don't have this sort of missing at random assumption going on here, but you have some like more gnarly selection problem. Am I misunderstood? Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, I see your point now. Yeah, no, that's a nice point that, so yeah, you can think of it as like, we're abstracting away from kind of like the other optimization problem of conditional on what neighborhoods we go to, how do we go and find crime within those neighborhoods? So we're not considering that. But yeah, that's an interesting point that there might be heterogeneity in groups and like how easy it is to detect the crime in that group. So yeah, we haven't really explored that, but that's a nice idea.
Thanks.
That's been proposed with like open air drug markets versus drug use in like private homes. And so then when you have when group access to like a private home is correlated with race, then you've got this detection problem in drug enforcement. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, we should think about that more. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine you probably don't quite get like the feedback dynamics we're going to study, but I imagine you could get some similar effects where, yeah, if for whatever reason a particular group, it's like easier to detect crime among them,
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not just what I'm worried, not just about sort of a difference in the ease of detecting crime across groups, but within groups, there's sort of a production function where it's like easier to detect crime for some people, but it gets harder as you ramp up policing, and that might be differential. That's what I mean by sort of signal quality. Like maybe the true crime is easier to detect, but the technology of that detection is different for the different groups. That might create some, I don't know if it's interesting, but it's definitely more complicated dynamics here. So just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, we haven't really thought about like that. Yeah, those kind of differences. We're trying to like limit the number of differences here. But yeah, that's a nice idea. Okay, so I think I'll move on. So so far I've told you first in a complete information environment how kind of beliefs map to policing allocations, and then we just showed you in the previous analysis how those allocations then affect beliefs. So now we're sort of in a classic, what we think of as a fixed point problem of trying to find an allocation where, given the belief that generates, it's in fact the optimal allocation. So you can also think of this in a dynamic setting of like, what if we started with an allocation, generated a bunch of data, adjusted our policing, like when will we reach a steady state? So again, it's going to be a point where the allocation is optimal given the belief that it generates. I'm going to mostly show you that with some pictures. So what I'm plotting here is think of the x-axis as maybe I'm writing it as actual allocation, but maybe think of it as an initial allocation. And then from that, we're gonna compute the new belief about the relative crime rates, and then plot the best response allocation given that belief. Okay. And so just at a first glance, we can see that this is increasing, which is capturing that notion that as, again, you police group A more, that's going to increase the belief about the relative crime rate, and you want to continue to police them more. So geometrically, what a steady state is going to look like here is just an intersection with this curve in the 45-degree line, right? So this is a point where the allocation, given the belief it generates, you kind of don't want to move up or down. And so in particular, you can maybe think that like we start, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but like we start maybe with an allocation above 1/2. even though if the initial allocation is above a half, you would want to keep policing group A more than a half. The fact that we're below the 45-degree line means that we're going to kind of move back towards 1/2. Okay. So there's also some kind of discussion in the paper of stability of steady states like this that I'll probably skip over. But here, so even though in principle this officer is forming incorrect beliefs, we're now moving to the top. We're looking at a part of the parameter space where they have no animus and where the real crime rates are equal. And so even if kind of off equilibrium paths, so to speak, their beliefs could be incorrect. At the steady state, they end up with correct beliefs and they end up policing both groups equally. So even though we have a potential for sort of extra discrimination here due to incorrect beliefs, if the parameters are such that they just allocate their time equally with full information, then we actually don't create don't create problems that wouldn't exist otherwise, is a way to think about it. However, so now what happens if the real crime rate of group A goes up? Well, we kind of shift this curve up. So you kind of always want to police group A more. And so now we end up spending most of our time policing group A. Though I haven't yet told you how much of that is driven by kind of real statistical discrimination versus these incorrect beliefs. And we'll get to that in a bit. Similar pictures, if there's no real difference in the crime rate, but the officer has animus towards group A, that also shifts this curve up. And we end up policing them more. Though again, I haven't decomposed what's driving that yet. And of course, there could be animus and statistical discrimination. And sometimes we can even end up in a situation where you police group A as much as possible. Okay, so now let's think about what's driving these disparities. So first, we can kind of do a classic decomposition of thinking about first with full information, how much different is the allocation than even policing, which is a half. So a way we can do that decomposition is remember this W stat is what an officer with no animus would do, right? But potentially it's still not equal because of differences in real crime rates. And so we can think about breaking this down into what's driven by statistical discrimination. So what you do with full information minus what a sort of a pure statistical discriminator would do, and then what a statistical discriminator would do minus half. In principle, these things could go in opposite directions, but if they go in the same direction, there's sort of a nice additive decomposition there. So now our new component is we're now gonna say, what we're gonna call inaccurate statistical discrimination. I think in line with Aislinn and Alex's work, is just gonna be the difference between what you do in this steady state with potentially incorrect beliefs and what you would do if you had full information. So we're gonna think about now a sort of additional third component to what might drive disparities. And so here's what that looks like on our diagram. So if we're in a world where we allocate our policing equally, there's in fact no discrimination, so kind of nothing to show. But so in the case where we make it so group A has a higher crime rate, again, this leads to policing group A more. But for these particular parameters, really only about half of that is driven by sort of accurate statistical discrimination, right? So if the officer had correct beliefs, we would be at this dotted line in the middle. But as we allow for incorrect beliefs, we allow for this inferential mistake, we're roughly doubling the amount of discrimination that we get. And, it's like hard to know how to think about the magnitudes here. It's a sort of simple theoretical model, but sort of broadly speaking, kind of relatively small amounts of this bias can lead to quite a bit more discrimination. Similarly, now here we have crime rates are equal in reality. We give the officer some animus, they police group A more. And again, we're like roughly doubling what we would get in the standard model. Here, this is a situation where if we had full information, we would have some statistical and some taste-based discrimination, but both of which produce more policing of group A. But actually here, like the bulk of the discrimination is being driven by incorrect beliefs. Okay, so with full information, we'd be policing group A bit more, but once we add this inferential mistake, here we're reaching a corner solution where you just want to police group A as much as possible. So this just the kind of proposition version of this is that as long as there's sort of any level of this non-conditioning bias or this inferential mistake, if it happens to be the case that with full information there'd be no disparity, then adding in inaccurate beliefs doesn't do anything. But as long as you're not at the knife edge case of no discrimination, we find that these incorrect beliefs are just going to amplify whatever disparities would otherwise exist. Right? So if we would police group B with more discrimination, we just sort of move further to the left of that diagram. And also the officer is generically going to have incorrect beliefs in that setting. And then just another kind of natural extension of that is we can then ask, okay, what happens if you change this new parameter? What happens if you make this inferential mistake worse? It has sort of the natural effect of it's just going to make that amplification even bigger than it would be otherwise. Right? And in fact, we can show for our kind of main parameterization, if this inferential mistake gets sufficiently bad, then we always end up at a corner solution, as long as we would have some disparity with complete information. Right? So as long as you allow us to ramp this up, we're going to want, the officer is going to want to spend as much time as possible policing one group. Even if sort of with full information, there'd be very, very small differences. So this is sort of the kind of the end of our first officer model. Again, key results here that we're amplifying disparities, and that this probably like this diagram is probably kind of the most important one. This is an illustration of how racial animus actually causes statistical discrimination. Right. So this kind of this section of the discrimination here is indirectly caused by the animus, even though in approximate sense it's statistical discrimination. Really, the underlying cause is racial animus. Okay, so we then have an extension with multiple officers. Obviously, crime data is going to be a function of the choices made by a lot of people. There's different layers of bureaucracy. Beat officers make choices too. And these officers might vary both in their racial animus and their ability to process data correctly. Okay, so we could have some racist officers, we could have some officers who took Alex's MBA class and learned how to think about selection problems, and other ones who didn't. I'll go through this quickly. I mean, the general idea is the same. We're just going to like add comma i's after everything. So we're going to have two officers. We're going to think about both the officers are making an allocation decision. We can think about the crime caught among group J by officer I, following a similar logic. To make things simple, we're going to make kind of a probably unrealistic assumption that the officers just have preferences over the crime that they catch. So what we want to do is we want to start with a situation where with full information, the officers would be sort of solving independent problems and there'd be no spillovers. So if they had preferences over total crime caught, there could actually be spillovers where as one officer polices group A more, that might affect the other's decision. That's probably realistic, but we're going to set things up so that's not true. So they only care about the crime they catch by themselves. And so again, with full information, what officer 1 does would have no effect on officer 2. They're going to sort of have, the crime data again. So they're going to observe the total crime caught among each group. We're also going to assume they have the allocation data. Maybe a bit more unrealistic here that like one thing we've done a bit of but haven't played around with too much is like maybe the officer knows their own allocation but not the others. The dynamics of that are pretty similar. And so the same idea of our biased belief process is that they're kind of not going to fully adjust for these total allocations, right? So now to form beliefs correctly, you have to adjust for both what you do and what the other officer does. Really, so as long as the officers are like not doing one of those things correctly, then we get these dynamics where their beliefs about the crime rate of group A are increasing potentially in both what they do and what the other officer does. I mean, again, once you kind of understand that, the logic is pretty straightforward. That we then get we call prejudice spillover. So if you say ramp up the animus of officer 1 and they police group A more, then that's going to then affect the beliefs of officer 2. Right. So again, you can have an officer who has no racial animus, but who sort of behaves as if they do because of the animus of others. So it's really like a formal statement of the bad apple ruining the barrel. There's also a slightly more subtle result that like also as you make the inferential mistakes of one officer worse in the sense of changing their new parameter, that also can lead the other officers to discriminate more. So kind of as you make this behavioral bias worse among some officers, that's going to affect the behavior of others as well. So kind of wrapping up what we think we learned from this particular paper. So first, just the broad point that really taste-based and statistical discrimination are inseparable, right? So not only are incorrect beliefs an important thing to study, but they also sort of problematize the notion that these are independent forces that explain discrimination. And in particular, animus or prejudice can cause inaccurate statistical discrimination. Also, I mean, this is like probably not, not really news to most people, but the idea that like statistical discrimination is sort of somehow okay, relies on a pretty heroic assumption that the beliefs that are used to do that are actually correct. And we think there's good reason to believe that, these are not just going to be like correct in some kind of, epsilon way, but there's reasons to think that they're going to be maybe quite incorrect and in particular directions. And again, the core idea is that this incorrect belief formation is under these assumptions going to amplify whatever discrimination we would see otherwise. And in fact, this prejudice can effectively be contagious across officers. So let's see. I think I'll maybe just spend a few minutes talking about a couple other things that we're working on, and maybe how I think some of the ideas here connect to some of the other papers. And then we'll hopefully have some time for some more questions. So, so one paper we're working on is has some similar ideas, but focuses more on the choices made by beat cops and how those interact with their social lives. So we have a model where officers, we think that there's a lot of officers, and they don't only decide how they behave on the beat, but they also decide, which group am I going to socialize with. So I think there's like a nice connection to the some of the contact hypothesis stuff that Betsy was talking about, where, let's say I like spend all my leisure time with group A and we have a nice time. I don't see a bunch of crimes. It's generally positive experiences. But then when I'm policing, I spend most of my time with group B, and I'm arresting them, I'm stopping and frisking them, generally having negative interactions. Well, if I don't adjust for the fact that I'm interacting with these groups in different contexts, it might lead me to think that, group A is this nice group that doesn't commit any crimes, and group B, all they do is go around stealing things and committing crimes. And so if you don't kind of properly adjust for the context that you're in, that can create some additional feedback loops where then I continue to only want to socialize with group A and police group B. So kind of theoretically, this ends up having pretty similar dynamics to the model that we discussed here. Reason why we're writing this as a separate paper is we think it ties nicely to a lot of the policy debates that are going on right now about policing. So questions about residency requirements, should we make police live in a certain area? Questions about how much do we try and make sure we're recruiting minorities? Questions about community-based policing. Should we try and force officers to spend some of their time kind of having more positive interactions with the community they deal with? So we think this model has some implications for questions like that. I'll just sort of quickly say I have another, I don't even have really a citation here because this is like another idea in progress, is to think about, so here in our current paper, we're thinking about like beliefs about crime rates which cause discrimination. But we also might think about like, where do people's beliefs about discrimination come from in the first place? If I, layperson, want to know, is there discrimination against group A in my society? Like, how do I decide that? Well, you might decide that by looking at the people in your social network or the people on TV and asking, do the people in group A do better than the people in group B? But so I think it's pretty easy to see that there's like another inferential problem there, that the people I know are not representative of the population. Believe it or not, political science professors at Berkeley have like different social networks than the US population as a whole. And so we have actually there's a grad student at Berkeley who, just to even add to the onslaught of Berkeley here, who has a nice working paper about how actually local black-white inequality varies hugely in the US. So in some places, blacks and whites have pretty similar incomes. In other places, there's a bigger difference. And this in fact correlates with a lot of attitudes and behavior. So thinking about some sort of extensions of this, of like what happens if people try and learn about discrimination just by the people they know. And where I think things get particularly interesting, and to kind of connect to Carrie's presentation yesterday. So if there's, say, discrimination in lending, that can lead to an interesting dynamic where, the blacks that I see in my neighborhood are actually going to be even higher income than the whites because it's harder for them to get loans. And so discrimination in lending can actually screw up inferences we make about discrimination in other So kind of have like some dinky little models of this, and if anyone's interested in working on this, I kind of have many ideas of what to do. So I'll wrap up here. So you can also think about using these ideas to, again, so you could study like individual level police interaction. So you could think about, I see a person, do I stop and frisk them, or do I pull them over? Obviously, this would connect to the bail decision papers we saw yesterday. You can think of hiring decisions. So one intuition I want to plant in your head here, even though we haven't really explored this too much yet, is that in some of these situations, it may actually be possible to get negative feedback loops based on incorrect beliefs. So just a quick intuition for this is, like, let's say I only hire people from group A if they're really qualified because I have animus against them. Well, then lo and behold, the group A people I hire are going to be super talented and productive. And so here, this non-conditioning bias might actually attenuate discrimination in certain contexts. I think you can come up with similar stories for some of those other contexts as well. So I think one broader theoretical question, which might be interesting to explore, is when do we see these positive versus negative feedback loops based on these misspecified models? We've been talking a lot about positive feedback loops, but I certainly don't think that that's necessarily a ubiquitous thing, that necessarily these incorrect beliefs are going to lead to positive feedback. And then finally, one more other question to throw out that we've started thinking about a bit is, so what if you like replace the officer in this model with an algorithm? So we're going to say this is now a model of predictive policing, and say that we just did not write our algorithm correctly and we forgot to condition on a particular variable. So can we think about the differences between humans and algorithms in terms of like what they're able to condition on and what they do condition on? And that sort of might be a difference between algorithmic and human decision making. So I have sort of no concrete results on that yet. We think that these broader kind of misspecified model ideas might be useful for addressing these algorithms versus humans questions. So we got about 10 minutes, so I think I'll stop there. Looks like there was a lot in the chat, so hopefully Ryan answered all your questions, but happy to take more or expand on anything. So thanks so much.
All right, thanks so much, Andrew. Really interesting talk. And as we've been talking about throughout the conference, it's really inaccurate beliefs are something new we've been thinking about in economics. It's really neat to see this particular form of bias provide really a foundation for a really compelling reason why we may see such inaccurate beliefs emerging in a particular context. So super interesting paper. So we have about 10 minutes or so. We can take questions, usual format, either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and chime in. And we could also, if anyone wanted to further expand on some of the things in the chat over here, we can do that as well.
I'll just follow up briefly on the chat. So I really like this suggestion that we explore this potential difference between the communities with respect to the crime detection function. As I already mentioned, and Andrew mentioned, I don't think that it's going to massively change the qualitative conclusions, but it would be interesting to see how potentially exogenous features of these two communities interact with this bias. And I mean, of course, it creates more complications. So then we have many more moving parts, many more sources of discrimination. But I think one promising direction to explore, at least with respect to thinking about sort of the empirical things we can measure, is thinking about how differences in the crime detection function across the communities could interact with the bias and create maybe more behavioral type discrimination in one community versus another, or increase or reduce the disparity that we identify in the paper.
I had a question. So I think this is really an interesting idea that you're exploring here. So I don't know much about this evidence on the selection neglect problem and how pervasive it is. I can certainly understand why we would assume. I could certainly see examples of why that might be an issue. Here it seems particularly easy to solve the selection problem. I mean, you've kind of structured this way to make the model simple, but it's just a matter of scaling by the amount of time you're spending somewhere. And so I guess one question is, are there cases where you see selection neglect where the selection process is that simple? And then a second question I had is, I wonder if you could get at this same idea with basically just a reformulation, where the selection neglect is maybe a little more, at least plausible to me. And that would be one where you have this allocation problem, but in addition to the amount of time you're spending somewhere, there's a question of how intensely do I search people when I'm policing in that area? So do I decide to stop and frisk 1% of people versus 20% of people? And there I might endogenously decide, okay, I'm gonna search more people from this group. And because I think they're more likely to, say, carry contraband, I'm not going to search this other group because I don't think they're likely to carry contraband. And because I never end up searching that kind of low probability group very often, I never kind of learn whether, oh, actually, I could have found contraband more often if I searched them 20% of the time. But I never do that, and I never take into account the fact that all of my past information is driven by these endogenous search decisions. I think you might be able to kind of reformulate the same exact model with that kind of structure. And that feels a little more plausible to me than thinking about, how much contraband am I finding per hour? Like that seems like a simple selection problem to solve. Whereas thinking about my past effort might be a little more complicated.
Yeah, thanks. So what you should, the Enki paper that we cite briefly, it's really remarkable how in that experiment, I forget, it's probably with undergrads at some university, and if you read the protocol, the protocol is so explicit about the fact that there's a selection problem. It's not subtle at all. They're here's some numbers, and they're we're not going to tell you the below average numbers. What do you think the average is? So I think I think to a certain extent, even though it seems kind of obvious, I think even when this problem is staring you in the face, a lot of people will still make this mistake. Again, even pretty smart, educated people. But yeah, I totally take the point that we're focusing on a relatively easy solvable problem, or in principle correctable problem. I think so yeah, one answer is yes, I think that's right, that there this question of intensity is harder to observe and harder to keep track of. But I think just more generally, I think a lot of what drives problems like this is just the unobservability of variables that you should be conditioning on, right? Again, I think there's a really tight connection with not any specific empirical result, but the problems that empirical researchers face, right? So so you might think that yeah, the officer knows what I told my beat cops to do, but they don't necessarily know if given their discretion they spent more time in one area or not, or exactly as you said, they may just be more aggressive in confronting people of a certain group, right? I just don't think it's realistic that any high-level decision maker is going to have data like that. So again, we kind of focused here on a setting where we think this bias is really easy to express and really easy to handle. But yeah, I definitely think that in the background, we're absolutely thinking of the kind of forces that you're talking about as well. In this context, those actually may be the more relevant ones. I think it's a bit hard to say for sure. But yeah, hopefully you agree that what we're doing is in the spirit of the kind of bias you're talking about.
But I think also the bias Conrad mentions can interact with selection neglect, in the sense that if you're constrained learning, if you're endogenously generating data and then you have certain beliefs that lead you to not generate certain data, and then also you're neglecting the selection process that got you there, they very much go, they're sort of different underlying key ideas, but they very much go hand in glove in terms of they could exacerbate each other or lead to even more severe inaccurate beliefs than say either one in isolation. So that could also be interesting to think about in a more dynamic process of how would selection neglect impact your beliefs, and then with endogenous decisions impacting the future information you generate, how would it further impact, say, the role of your selection neglect in creating inaccurate beliefs?
Yeah, and I mean, and I think it'll like depend a lot on how you write down the problem and like what information people have. So actually that's like another area where in principle I think you can get a negative feedback loop on the individual officer level, because it's like, you know, if I look for contraband among every person of a group that I ever see, like my hit rate's going to be low, right? And so, but at the same time, if like the higher ups don't have access to the fact that this officer is always stopping people in that group, then you get a different bias. So I think it really depends on kind of the problem you're writing down and the information that people have available. And so yeah, that's why we need to write more models like this.
I also just want to add that this seems to be something that keeps coming up in the context of police departments. This exact problem that we're identifying, that police officers are basing allocation decisions, or like high level people are basing allocation decisions on like arrest data or something like that. So it is like, I actually think it's kind of good that it's an easy problem to solve, in the sense that like if we want the problem solved, then it's nice to be able to point to this sort of simple mistake in forming beliefs as like a solution to a large chunk of a racial disparity generated in a police department. And it appears as though, you know, police officers and high level people keep sort of making this inferential mistake, like empirically. I mean, lawsuits about the stop and frisk policy is the most famous example of the police department providing data on sort of counts of crimes or contraband found, and the judge actually being like, no, you have to control for how intensely you police these neighborhoods.
I mean, along the same lines, just like the whole principle of criminal profiling is exactly this. We're still, you know, you develop a profile on the basis of the criminals that you found. And this is like how, for the last 80 years, like they've thought about training officers to be good investigators, to be good observers of potential crime.
Right, and it turns out that it's important to have that data, but it's also important to know how to analyze it.
Yeah, thanks again, Andrew.
Really helpful. Great stuff in the chat. Yeah, we'll follow up on some of these links. It's really helpful.
Cool. Yeah, so, and just to highlight quickly, Luis Pierre sent a paper as well, that he has an interesting job market paper about labor markets and thinking about these sorts of constrained learning. He was an econ student from Michigan on the market last year. Thanks again, Andrew. Really interesting talk, really great stuff.